Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, we journey into the heart of the West African savannas, into the world of the Fulani griots. These were the traveling storytellers, the bards whose voices carried the history, culture, and very soul of entire communities. Picture it, vast grasslands stretching endlessly under a wide African sky, where dust devils dance with the wind and the faint scent of smoke from distant fires hangs in the air. It was here, in this liminal space between earth and sky, that the griots walked. They carried with them tales older than the most ancient baobab, songs more enduring than any carved stone. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine the fire crackling softly beside us as we rest beneath a blanket of stars. This is the world we're stepping into. To be a Fulani griote was no simple calling. It was a life of constant motion, a delicate balancing act between memory and improvisation, between sacred duty and sheer survival. These storytellers weren't mere entertainers. They were walking libraries, living repositories of lineage, genealogy, moral lessons, and sacred history. Every single word they uttered, every chord they strummed on their hadu or riti, carried the immense weight of generations. In an era when very few could read or write, their voices were the ink and parchment of a people. By the end of this journey together, you'll understand not just the practical hardships of a griot's existence, but the profound spiritual and social gravity that made them so indispensable. Their days began long before the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in soft, golden hues. Fires would be stoked to prepare a simple meal, instruments carefully tuned and worn cords repaired. Journeys were mapped out in the mind before the first hoofbeats echoed across the quiet savannah. They traveled light, carrying only what was absolutely essential, a musical instrument. Perhaps a few scrolls of poetry or mnemonic chords, and a heart heavy with stories waiting to be told. The rhythm of their travel, often on foot or horseback, mirrored the very cadence of their songs, deliberate, flowing, almost meditative. But make no mistake, the life of a griot was far from easy. Socially, they occupied a strange and delicate position, at once revered and marginalized. They were entrusted with the most intimate details of community life, yet they often lived on the fringes, dependent on the generosity of their patrons, migrating from one settlement to the next. To survive, a griot had to master more than just the art of memory and narration. They needed the skills of a diplomat, a negotiator, and a keen observer. Every village had its own unique customs, and every patron demanded a slightly different cadence, a subtle tailoring of the ancient stories to fit local sensibilities and flatter local pride. They were, in essence, a living bridge. They connected the past to the present, the nobility to the common folk, and sacred knowledge to the rhythms of everyday life. With every tale of epic heroes, great migrations, and profound moral lessons, they taught, they cautioned, they entertained, and they healed. To hear a griot perform was to be reminded of the invisible threads that hold a people together, threads woven from words, from music, and from shared memory. The soundscape was just as important as the words themselves. The soft, rhythmic tapping of a drum, the low hum of the wind sweeping across the plains. The distant call of Catalor, of it blended with the griot's voice to create a living, breathing experience. Stories were never just recited, they were performed. Every gesture, every dramatic pause was deliberate, designed to echo through the senses. As a listener, you weren't just a passive recipient of information. You became an active participant in a timeless dance between memory and imagination, transported by the power of the performance. In this episode, we will explore the challenges and hardships of being a Fulani. storyteller, the pivotal role they played in preserving their society, the beautiful intricacies of their epic poetry, and the elite families who cultivated and patronized these keepers of memory. We'll wander with them along dusty trade routes, pause at village hearths, and listen under the vast, starry sky as history itself whispers through their mouths. And now, as the embers of our fire glow softly and the night stretches its dark arms across the plains, we step into the first chapter of this journey. We'll delve into the daily life, the constant struggles, and the quiet, subtle triumphs of the Fulani Griot. Thank you for joining. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories. You are listening to Under Baobab Skies, and the story begins now. Imagine the life of a Fulani Griot, life that demanded a resilience few of us could ever truly comprehend. From the moment they were born, they were set upon a path that required not just physical endurance, but an almost superhuman mental fortitude. The roads they traveled were not paved highways. They were rough, unyielding tracks stretching across sun-scorched plains, dry riverbeds, and through winding, dusty valleys. They carried only what was absolutely essential. But even the lightest of burdens would feel immense after countless hours walking beneath an unrelenting sun. Their very existence depended on the goodwill of strangers. Every village they approached was a new stage, a new audience, but also a new test of survival. Would they be welcomed with open arms, offered food, water, and shelter, or would they be met with suspicion, their knowledge seen as a threat by those who guarded their own secrets? In some villages, the arrival of a griot was a cause for celebration. Children would peer out from behind doorways, their eyes wide with curiosity, while elders, seated on mats in the shade, would watch with a knowing, ancient gaze. But in other places, a cold shoulder or a wary glance was all the welcome they would receive. A single misstep in their performance, a forgotten line in a poem, a misremembered name in a long genealogy could have devastating consequences. It wasn't just about embarrassment. A mistake could lead to a loss of patronage, which meant no food, no shelter, and no support. In the most severe cases, it could lead to outright censure from the community, a social shunning that was a fate worse than any physical hardship. Their reputation, built over years of flawless recitation, could be shattered in a single moment of human error. Memory was the griot's most vital instrument, their most sacred tool, and it demanded constant, unwavering vigilance. Unlike the historians we know today, who rely on written texts and archives, the griot's library was housed entirely within their own mind. They navigated centuries of history using intricate mental maps, epic songs, complex mnemonic devices, and the steady, hypnotic pulse of rhythms passed down through generations. Forgetting was simply not an option. It was a betrayal of their entire lineage. Every name, every ancestor, every pivotal battle, every royal marriage, it all had to be recalled with absolute precision, often in the presence of the very descendants of the people whose stories they were telling. To make an error was not just a personal failure. It was to risk being cast out, exiled from the very tradition they had dedicated their entire life to preserving. Imagine the pressure, the sheer mental weight of carrying the collective memory of a people on your shoulders every single day. But the challenges weren't confined to the stage or the mind. The journey itself was fraught with peril. The physical world presented its own set of trials. Vast, sun-scorched plains that shimmered with heat, sudden and violent storms that could turn a dry path into a raging torrent, and treacherous river crossings where a single slip could be fatal. And then there were the human threats, the ever-present risk of bandits lying in wait along a lonely stretch of road, preying on solitary travelers. Beyond that, disease was a constant companion on the trail, with no modern medicine to rely on. Nights were often spent out in the open, under a vast blanket of stars. The only shelter might be a gnarled acacia tree, the only warmth from a small, crackling fire. As they rested, they would listen to the sounds of the African night, the distant roar of a predator, the whisper of the wind through the tall grasses, or the soft, rhythmic movement of a distant cattle herd. These conditions didn't just shape their bodies, making them lean and tough. They shaped their minds, instilling a deep, instinctual rhythm of vigilance and endurance that became as natural as breathing. And the social hardships were just as daunting. Griots occupied a strange, marginal space in society. They were simultaneously essential and distrusted. On one hand, they were the glue that held the community together, the educators, the entertainers, the diplomats, and the moral arbiters. Their words could heal old wounds, reconcile feuding families, and remind a village of its shared, glorious history. But on the other hand, their nomadic lifestyle and their dependence on the generosity of patrons made them vulnerable. They couldn't easily own land, their material possessions were few, and their lives were often dictated by the whims and demands of those who sought their talents. They were outsiders, even as they stood at the very center of cultural life. This paradox was the tightrope they walked every single day. They were revered for the knowledge they carried, yet sometimes scorned for the way they lived. But it's crucial to understand this. Within all these immense challenges lay the quiet, powerful triumph of their art and their agency. Even when facing hardship, the griot's voice was a formidable tool. It was a weapon of memory, a shield of morality, and a vessel for the entire community's identity. Their songs could breathe courage into the hearts of warriors facing an invasion, or bring hope to a community suffering through a devastating drought. Their survival was never just a physical matter of finding food and shelter. It was about the far more profound act of sustaining the intangible, spiritual essence of their culture through the relentless, beautiful exercise of memory and performance. As they sat by a river at dawn, the calm light casting shimmering reflections on the water, their voice would rise, weaving stories of heroes and kings, while livestock grazed peacefully in the distance. Their art was their resilience. Their performance was their power. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine that scene. The fire crackles softly beside you, and we rest together beneath the vast star-filled sky, the stories of the griots still echoing in our minds. What we've explored today is just the beginning of their incredible journey. This is only the hardship, the foundation of their strength. In the next part of our series, we will delve deeper. We will explore the quiet brotherhoods they formed on the road, the sacred bonds between master and apprentice, and the subtle, profound joys that sustained the griot through a lifetime of travel, memory, and storytelling. The sun rises gently over the Sahel. Its light, soft and honey-colored, spreads across the grasslands where the Fulani people begin their day. The air hums faintly with the sound of cattle bells, and somewhere in the distance, a single flute carries a tune, one that only a griot might recognize. It is a song of remembrance, of quiet endurance, of stories passed from father to son, mother to daughter, for generations unbroken. The Fulani griots, known in some regions as asterisk or Luke asterisk, were more than entertainers. They were the guardians of memory, the silent scribes of an unwritten world. Yet, behind their confident voices and rhythmic drums lay a life both disciplined and fragile. To be a griot meant living between two worlds, the humble and the honored, the spiritual and the political, the forgotten and the immortal. A typical day for a Fulani griot began before sunrise. The early hours, before the herds moved and before the market stirred, were the best time for practice. The griot would sit alone, a small drum or lute by his side, whispering old verses into the morning air. These were not mere rehearsals, they were rituals of remembrance. The griot would recite the names of ancestors, the victories of chiefs, the lineage of noble families. Each syllable had to be precise, each rhythm faithful to the ancestors who first spoke it. Because a griot's craft was not written in books, it lived entirely within memory. Forgetting even a single verse was a small tragedy. So they trained themselves through constant repetition, echoing stories until they lived permanently behind the tongue. When a griot spoke, his words carried the weight of hundreds of years, a human library built from sound, discipline, and faith. But the days were long, and the road unkind. Griots often traveled on foot, moving between villages for festivals, weddings, or funerals. They carried their instruments. They hadu, a kind of lute. The balafon, a wooden xylophone, or a simple talking drums slung over their backs. Each step they took across the dusty plains of Mali, Niger, or northern Nigeria was a step closer to a new audience, a new host, a new test of endurance. Some griots joined caravans, telling stories at night in exchange for food or a safe place to sleep. Others traveled with noble families, their voices expected to glorify the clan's history at every gathering. But for most, survival depended on generosity and whether their songs could soften the hearts of strangers. There were nights when they were welcomed with open arms, fed, given mats to sleep on, and praised as honored guests. And there were nights when they were met with suspicion, treated as beggars, or even turned away. To be a griot was to live without certainty, yet always with purpose. Despite their hardships, griots built bonds that lasted lifetimes. Among themselves, they formed brotherhoods, informal yet sacred networks of trust and respect. A griot could arrive in a distant town and find shelter among other storytellers. They would share food, exchange stories, and teach each other new verses. These gatherings, often held in the cool of evening, were the hidden schools of oral tradition. There were unspoken rules within these brotherhoods. One did not steal another's song or boast falsely of their lineage. Storytelling was a sacred inheritance, not a competition. If a griot performed a story belonging to another family, he first sought permission. This was not only etiquette, it was an act of reverence. Words, like cattle, had owners. Within these brotherhoods, the young learned humility. Apprenticeship could last for years. A boy born into a griot family might begin by fetching water for the elders, then by learning how to tune instruments, before being allowed to sing a single line of an old poem. The test of readiness came not from age, but from memory and from spirit. A young griot who spoke too fast or without depth was gently corrected. You speak the words, an elder might say, but you do not yet feel the silence between them. To feel the silence, that was the secret art. It meant knowing when to let a pause carry the meaning more deeply than the sentence itself. Griots were, in a sense, the philosophers of the Fulani world. They didn't build monuments or carve statues. Their legacy was sound and spirit. They observed life carefully, translating the wisdom of herders, farmers, and travelers into rhythm and metaphor. Through proverbs and parables, they reminded people of humility, justice, and endurance. For example, when two clans quarreled over grazing rights, a griot might intervene. He would not accuse or command. Instead, he would tell a story perhaps about two rivers that once flowed together, only to destroy each other when they turned against one another. By the end of the tale, the message was clear. The Griot's words carried the power to mend wounds that even chiefs could not heal. Still, this power came with isolation. Griots often stood apart from ordinary Fulani life. They were not herders or warriors. They belonged to a separate social stratum respected for their knowledge, yet marked by their role. In some places, intermarriage between Griot families and others was discouraged. It was believed that the power of words ran too deep, that marrying a Griot could change one's destiny. So, Griots lived on the edges, neither commoners nor nobles, neither fully free nor truly bound. But within those edges, they found freedom of another kind, the freedom to speak truth through story. Their songs could praise, but they could also warn. Their verses could glorify, but they could also remind rulers of their mortality. When night returned to the Sahel, the Griot's real work began. Fires were lit, drums tuned, and the people gathered. Children sat near the front, eyes wide with anticipation. The elders leaned back, listening for the patterns of familiar names and forgotten battles. The Griot would raise his instrument, tap gently, and begin sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a laugh. He might sing of a hero who crossed the Niger River on horseback, or of a woman whose beauty caused kings to wage war. Each performance was both entertainment and archiva, bridge between generations. In the pauses between verses, one could almost feel the ancestors listening to, and so the brotherhood of griots endured through droughts, through wars, through the fading of kingdoms. Their craft was not bound to palaces or written pages. It lived wherever people gathered to remember who they were. When famine struck, a griot might turn his songs toward hope. When peace returned, he would sing of its beauty. In this way, the griot's voice was both mirror and medicine, reflecting the pain and healing the soul. They were not merely historians. They were emotional anchors, binding a people to their humanity through story. And though their hands bore calluses from drums and travel, their hearts carried an unshakable faith that no culture dies as long as its stories are still being told. So we see that the griot's long days were not empty toil. They were the rhythm behind the heartbeat of Fulani identity. Each verse learned was a life preserved. Each night spent under strange stars was another thread in the fabric of continuity. The brotherhoods they formed, the sacrifices they made, and the wisdom they carried still echo through the modern Fulani. Whirled in songs sung at weddings, in proverbs whispered to children, in the quiet dignity of those who still travel with words as their only wealth. For the griots, every sunrise was a page, every sunset a closing line. But the story never truly ended. When night fully blankets the grasslands, the Fulani griot's voice becomes a beckoner, single flame glowing in the vastness of the dark. The cattle have settled, the markets have fallen silent, and the only sound is the steady rhythm of the drum echoing through the stillness. This is when the griot earns his place in eternity, not through wealth, but through memory. Every song he sings carries a lesson, a plea, or a remembrance. Yet, behind those melodies lies a deeper truth. Every performance is an act of survival. To live as a griot was to battle silence itself, to fight against forgetting, against invisibility, against the erosion of one's people's past. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly, and the night holds its breath. The griot's first tool of survival was adaptation. In times of drought or war, when villages scattered and patrons disappeared, the griot learned to adjust his message. He might turn his old songs of triumph into songs of endurance. He might trade stories of kings for tales of mothers who walked for days to find water. Each story was still truth, but it was truth shaped by necessity. In the Sahel, survival required flexibility. When the herders moved south, so did the Griot. When new rulers rose, he reshaped his verses to honor them not out of flattery, but to keep history flowing. The Griot's genius lay in knowing when to speak of the past and when to reshape it for the living. But survival wasn't only about movement. It was also about memory as endurance. The Griot's mind was both a map and a vault. Some Griots could recite a lineage going back 15 generations. Others remembered the names of every warrior who had fought in the great Sahelian wars, their victories woven into verses that never faded. To forget was to lose power. So Griots trained their minds like hunters trained their bodies. Each name, each proverb, each rhythm became muscle memory, a sacred kind of mental discipline. While outsiders wrote history in books, griots wrote it in breath. Even today, among older Fulani communities, you might hear the opening of a griot's recital. I am the river that forgets no name, the drum that beats across time. Speak your truth, and I shall make it live. Those words were not poetry alone, they were survival itself. But survival had another layer, spiritual resilience. The griots' songs were shields against despair. When herds were lost to drought, people gathered around the griot, not just for entertainment, but for hope. He reminded them that the land had seen hardship before, that their ancestors had walked this same path and prevailed. Through stories, he turned tragedy into rhythm. He made meaning out of suffering. When crops failed, his verses became a kind of prayer, a reminder that even in hunger, the spirit of the people remained unbroken. Let's pause here for a moment. The night grows still, and the sound of distant drums fades like a heartbeat under the stars. Yet the griot's survival also depended on diplomacy. A careless word could endanger his life. He had to walk the fine line between truth and tact-telling stories that honored both the noble and the common without offending either. In royal courts, his voice could elevate a ruler's name across kingdoms. But that same voice could also expose arrogance, disguised as a parable. When he warned of greed or cruelty, he did so through fables. A foolish king might be represented as a hyena who devoured his own pack, while a wise leader might appear as a lion who guarded the herd. The griot's gift was in using story to say what could not be said directly. It was survival through cleverness, a mastery of subtle rebellion. Griots also survived through interdependence. No griot lived entirely alone. They relied on the generosity of patrons, but they offered something deeper in return. A family with a griot could be assured that their ancestors would never be forgotten. The griot sang their praises, chronicled their victories, and remembered their genealogies. When the next generation came of age, it was the griot who would recount the story of their lineage, linking them to heroes of old. But when famine struck and generosity ran dry, griots faced hunger like everyone else, and yet they still sang. Some say this endurance was what gave their voices such power, because they sang not from comfort, but from the edge of survival itself. Let's pause here for a moment. The wind sighs softly, and the smell of distant rain drifts through the air. Over time, griots became masters of the unspoken contract. They gave honor in exchange for respect, remembrance in exchange for survival. It was not wealth they sought, but continuity. And in their own way, they succeeded. Their words outlived kingdoms. When the empires of Mali and Songhai fell, when cities turned to dust, the griots' songs remained carried from mouth to mouth, drum to drum, until they became the pulse of a people who refused to be erased. But survival sometimes meant changing the story itself. When Islam spread through the Sahel, griots faced new realities. Some verses were altered to fit the moral codes of the faith. Others were hidden, whispered only in trusted circles. Instead of invoking ancient spirits, griots began to weave Quranic wisdom into their songs. This merging of traditions was not surrender, it was strategy. It kept their art alive under new rulers and new beliefs. Their music adapted, their rhythms shifted, but their essence remained unchanged. Even now, in towns across northern Nigeria, Niger and Mali, modern griots blend Fulani praise poetry with Islamic hymns, creating a harmony that speaks of centuries of survival, a song that has bent but never broken. And beyond faith and famine, griots also fought against erasure by modernity. As colonial powers drew borders across the Sahel, oral traditions were dismissed as folklore, unreliable, they said. But the griots knew otherwise. They understood that their songs carried not just stories, but codes, ecological wisdom, genealogical records, maps of migration, lessons of leadership. What outsiders called myth was, in truth, a sophisticated form of knowledge. So the griots kept singing, sometimes in secret, sometimes for small crowds, preserving not just memory but dignity. In their verses lived resistance, a refusal to be rewritten by others. Let's pause here for a moment. The stars shimmer quietly above the plains, and the fire burns low. In modern times, the griots' survival has taken on new forms. Some record their music in studios. Others teach their children to perform at cultural festivals. But the essence remains the same: storytelling as preservation. Among the Fulani diaspora in Senegal, Cameroon, and Nigeria, griots now sing of migration, of climate change, of identity in a world that moves too fast to listen. Their words still remind people where they come from, and why that matters. To survive, the griot had to be more than a historian. He had to be part poet, part psychologist, part philosopher. He had to understand the human heart and speak to it in ways that transcended fear. His greatest survival strategy was compassion, the ability to connect across differences, to remind people that their struggles were shared. Whether among nobles or nomads, the griot's voice made everyone feel seen. This emotional intelligence, this empathy woven into rhythm became the soul of Fulani storytelling. It's what makes their songs linger in the heart long after the drum falls silent. Let's pause here for a moment. The flames flicker, and the griot's song fades into a whisper carried by the wind. By the end of this part, we see how the griot's survival was not simply about endurance, but transformation. Through every hardship, hunger, exile, changing faiths, lost patrons, he adapted, reimagined, and continued to sing. His art was both shield and mirror. It kept a people's soul alive when all else seemed lost. And that is why, even today, when a Fulani griot begins his tale, people still fall silent because they know they are about to hear not just a story, but a history that survived against all odds. When dawn breaks over the Sahel, the light doesn't just touch the land, it seems to awaken the memory of generations. The grass glimmers silver in the early dew, and the cattle begin their low murmurs as herders prepare for the long day ahead. In the quiet before movement, a voice might rise, not to command, but to remind. A griot begins a story, one that weaves the people's soul back together before the work begins. Among the Fulani, storytelling was never just art. It was instruction, prayer, and remembrance. It was the quiet backbone of a people whose lives stretched across thousands of miles and centuries of change. Storytelling bound them through lineage, through lessons, through love. Let's pause here for a moment. The morning air is soft, the fire crackles low, and the griot's first words ripple like light across calm water. To understand the role of storytelling in Fulani society, you must first understand their way of life. The Fulani spread across West and Central Africa are pastoralists, travelers, and traders. Their wealth moves with them. Cattle, stories, and songs carried like wind over the savannah. In such a mobile world, stories were their maps. They carried knowledge across distance. When a griot told of rivers that once ran dry or of grazing lands cursed by conflict, his words guided future generations. History became survival, not confined to parchment, but alive in breath and memory. Each story performed by a griot was a social ritual. It might begin at dusk, when the day's herding was done, and the people gathered in a semicircle around the fire. The youngest children sat closest, wide-eyed and barefoot. Behind them, elders nodded slowly, listening not only for the tale, but for how it was told, because every pause, every rhythm carried meaning. Through these gatherings, the griot did what books could not. He united generations. He reminded the youth that they were part of something older and larger than themselves. He reminded the elders that their wisdom still had a voice in the world. Let's pause here for a moment. The children's laughter fades, and all that remains is the voice, rising and falling like a steady wind through dry grass. The griot's stories also carried Fulani moral philosophy, known as Pula Aku, a code of conduct emphasizing self-control, patience, modesty, and respect. These weren't taught through lectures, but through narrative. If a tale told of a hunter who grew boastful and frightened his prey away, the lesson was humility. If it spoke of a herder who ignored advice and led his cattle into danger, the lesson was obedience and wisdom. Each parable served as a mirror, allowing listeners to reflect without shame. Through these tales, the griot became the conscience of the community. He held no authority in the formal sense, yet his voice carried moral weight that even chiefs respected. In his rhythm, people heard truth, softened by poetry, guidance without command. Storytelling also shaped education long before schools existed. The griot's narratives trained the memory, sharpened language, and preserved complex systems of oral classification, cattle breeds, star patterns, ancestral lineages. Among the Fulani, a skilled child might recite the names of their family's herds in melodic tones, each variation reflecting color, horn shape, or temperament. Griots transformed that same mnemonic power into art. Through repetition, children learned not only the content of the stories, but also the cadence, the musical rhythm that made learning feel like singing. It was this fusion of memory and melody that made griots both teachers and performers. Let's pause here for a moment. The cattle bells tinkle softly in the distance, and the griot's voice drifts between the low hum of the wind. In Fulani villages, storytelling also maintained social harmony. When disputes arose over land, cattle, or honor, the griot could intervene through a tale. Instead of direct confrontation, he might tell the story of two brothers whose pride nearly destroyed their family. Listeners understood the message, even when no names were mentioned. In this way, the griot mediated without accusation, healed without judgment. His performance restored balance through empathy, transforming conflict into reflection. It was a kind of social medicine, one that worked not by punishment, but by gentle persuasion. Beyond mediation, griots also served as record keepers, the living libraries of Fulani history. They memorized the births and deaths of noble families, the stories of migrations, and the pacts between clans. Their genealogies could trace a bloodline back to a single ancestor who first crossed the Niger River centuries earlier. Such detail was not mere vanity, it grounded identity. In a world where borders shifted and records could be lost, a griot's song was a passport of belonging. Even Islamic scholars traveling through the Sahel often relied on griots for historical context. Because griots remembered not only events but emotions, the tone of an era, the moral lessons within its victories and defeats. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire sighs, embers glow, and the past feels near enough to touch. Storytelling, too, was a spiritual act. Many Fulani griots began their performances with invocations, blessings to God, to ancestors, and to the spirits of memory. Before beginning a lineage tale, a griot might sprinkle water or milk on the ground, murmuring, "Let the words flow clean." To him, storytelling was not mere speech, it was sacred transmission. Words had weight, and misuse could bring misfortune. This reverence for speech is why griots were both feared and respected. Their praise could elevate a family's status, but their satire could haunt its descendants. To insult a griot was to risk being forgotten, which, in a culture of memory, was a fate worse than death. The griot's storytelling also reflected Fulani gender roles. While most griots were men, women held their own forms of oral tradition, lullabies, poetic praise songs, and laments. When a woman sang while grinding millet or tending fire, she was not merely filling silence. She was preserving domestic memory, names, proverbs, emotional truths. Griots often borrowed these melodies, reshaping them for public performance. Thus, storytelling was a collaboration across gender, a hidden dialogue between the public and private spheres of Fulani life. Both men and women shaped the oral landscape, even if history remembers one more than the other. Let's pause here for a moment. The hum of night insects rises, and the moon drapes its light across the open plains. Storytelling also preserved Fulani humor and resilience. The griots knew that laughter was as vital as memory. In difficult times, their tales became a release, full of witty exchanges, riddles, and clever tricksters who outsmarted the proud. One common story tells of a herder who lost all his cattle but convinced the wind to lend him its voice. The moral was simple. Even when you own nothing, your words can still carry you far. Through humor, griots taught courage. They turned sorrow into satire, failure into wisdom. In this way, the Fulani oral tradition became not just a record of history, but a practice of healing. Finally, storytelling in Fulani society was about continuity. A griot's apprentice did not just memorize words, he inherited responsibility. Learning to tell a story was learning how to hold time, to balance reverence for the past with creativity for the present. In some families, griot lineages stretched unbroken for centuries. The drum, the lute, and the memory all passed down like sacred heirlooms. The apprentice learned when to pause, when to weep, when to let silence speak louder than sound. This was the griot's true art, his ability to give shape to emotion without breaking its mystery. Let's pause here for a moment. The griot's apprentice listens, nods slowly, and the fire burns lower as dawn approaches. So when we say that storytelling was the heartbeat of Fulani life, we mean it literally. It was the rhythm of belonging, the pulse that united distant camps and scattered generations. Through it, they remembered how to be human, patient, proud, and connected. In every story told beneath the stars, the Fulani learned again who they were, and why their ancestors' voices must never fall silent. The Fulani griot did more than just remember. He repaired what time tried to tear apart. Across the wide grasslands and the whispering savannas, his voice was the thread that stitched families, clans, and distant camps together. When disputes brewed between cousins, or when pride hardened the hearts of chiefs, the griot's words came like gentle rain on dry earth, soft, deliberate, but powerful enough to make things grow again. He would sit between men whose tempers still smoldered, begin to hum a tune that both recognized from childhood, and slowly turn their memories toward the laughter of shared ancestors. No one could argue while a story was being told. And so, the Griot became not only the singer of heroes, but the keeper of peace. In societies without written constitutions, his memory was the archive of law. He remembered the treaties between clans, who gave cattle, who offered daughters in marriage, which boundary followed which river bend. His performance could restore justice. When a young herder refused to pay tribute to an older family, it was the Griot who recited the lineage back 7 generations to remind everyone of old obligations. His stories were not written on paper, but on people etched into their sense of belonging. The Griot did not accuse or command. He reminded, and that reminder carried the weight of truth, older than any decree. Through his rhythm and rhyme, justice felt like music. Every evening, when the herds returned and dust settled on the horizon, people gathered around fires in soft silence. Children sat closest, their faces half-lit, eyes wide. Mothers spun thread. Fathers rested on carved stools, heads tilted toward the voice that filled the night. The griot's tale became a communal heartbeat, one rhythm shared by everyone. He spoke of the first migrations, of rivers crossed and friendships forged in hardship. But he also told cautionary tales of arrogance punished, of greed that scattered brothers. His audience was not passive. They hummed, clapped, and laughed in rhythm. The griot was the conductor, but the people, they were the orchestra. In this shared ritual, community became realer, living thing that needed to be nourished with memory every night. Before the Fulani built schools or wrote down their alphabets, the griot was the first teacher. He taught through repetition and melody lessons that sank deep because they were sung, not spoken. A tale about a lazy herder was really a lesson in discipline. A story of a boastful warrior who lost his cattle was a parable about humility. The griot's art turned wisdom into entertainment. It made virtue memorable. Young boys often followed these storytellers for months, carrying their instruments, learning their intonations. They memorized how to pause before a moral turn, how to let the audience breathe between laughter and reflection. This was oral education, patient, rhythmic, and alive. From Senegal to northern Nigeria, from Guinea to Cameroon, Fulani griots formed invisible networks. They carried news, poetry, and proverbs across thousands of miles long before radio or roads. When a chief died in one region, his praise song would already be heard in another before the moon waned. The griot's movement kept the sense of one Fulani identity alive, despite distance and difference. Each griot adjusted his tone to the local rhythm, softer in pastoral villages, grander in royal courts. But everywhere, his message was the same: you belong to a story larger than yourself. Fulani griots understood balance not only in rhythm, but in society. Their tales praised courage, but also kindness. They honored wealth, but warned against pride. They could lift a man's name or quietly remind him of his flaws through allegory. That subtle power made them both respected and feared. A chief might smile at a griot's song, but he also listened carefully, for inside the praise there could be hidden advice. When rulers strayed, griots guided them back with story rather than confrontation. In this way, storytelling became diplomacy. Art turned into governance. Not all griot stories were about power. Many were about healing, the kind that mends hearts, not bodies. When tragedy struck, a drought, a raid, a lost child, people turned to the griot's voice. He did not promise miracles. He offered perspective. He reminded them that ancestors had endured worse, that laughter could return, that grief was part of the long song of life. In villages where hunger thinned the air, a griot's humor could still spark a smile. He kept despair from taking root. His laughter became medicine. Each story carried a thread of morality that held Fulani society together. The griot didn't say, "Do this or don't do that." He showed what happened when people forgot respect or compassion and let the listener decide. Through story, choice became a mirror. A good griot knew when to make his tale hopeful and when to make it haunting. Children grew up hearing that generosity invites rain, arrogance brings dust, and that a man's cattle are only as peaceful as his heart. These weren't laws, they were living proverbs, easy to remember because they rhymed with human experience. Sometimes, the most powerful stories were told in silence. A griot would begin a song, then stop and the crowd would hold its breath, waiting. He'd let the quiet linger, like a shared thought no one dared to speak. That stillness became part of the story. It was a sacred space where people remembered that words were gifts, not weapons. And in that silence, something unseen bound them, the feeling that even in hardship, they were not alone. At the heart of Fulani storytelling lies a circle not of shape, but of purpose. A story begins, travels through laughter, warning, and reflection, then returns home to its origin, to remind us who we are. Every night, that circle closes when the griot's final line fades into the dark. Tomorrow, another will open a new telling, a new audience, a continuation of the same heartbeat, long after the drums fall silent and the voices disperse. What remains is that shared rhythm, a society held together not by walls, but by words. Long before books found their way into these lands, the Fulani griots carried entire libraries in their minds. Think about that for a moment. Each poem, each song, each whisper of an ancestor's name, all of it lived inside them like a vast constellation of memory. The epic poems they guarded weren't written down. They were born, recited, reshaped, and passed on like a sacred inheritance. When a griot sang, something magical happened. Time itself seemed to loosen its grip. The past and the present would overlap, and for a few precious moments, the dead and the living sat side by side beneath the same sky, sharing the same air. The night is deep, the fire is small, and the stars stretch endless over the Sahel. To truly understand a Fulani epic, you have to step into the rhythm of movement itself. The Fulani people have wandered for centuries across grasslands, through forests, and along rivers, always following the call of their herds. Their stories move in the same way. They flow, never fixed in one place. They stretch across entire seasons, bending and swaying with the storyteller's breath. An epic might begin with the founding of a clan, then detour into the life of a legendary warrior, and finally return home through a gentle lullaby sung to cattle. It might take hours, or even days, to tell in its entirety. Each verse meticulously links identity to geography. A name is tied to a river, a proverb to a hill, a lineage to a specific grazing path. In this world, every place becomes sacred when it is sung about. The wind whispers through the tall grass, carrying fragments of a forgotten melody. A Fulani griot never began a poem casually. The opening line was an invocation, part prayer, part permission. It was a formal request, calling upon the ancestors and the invisible spirits of memory to guide his tongue. Because to misremember wasn't just a simple error. It was a profound act of disrespect to those who came before. So, before the first verse ever left his lips, he would whisper an ancient formula, "May my words not stumble, and may my heart walk straight." Only then would the chorus strings begin to hum, softly a sound like gentle rain tapping on stretched skin, and the poem would finally begin. As he started, the audience would lean closer, their breathing unconsciously sinking to the rhythm of his voice. The griot's voice would rise and fall like a tide, sometimes sharp and triumphant, celebrating a victory, and sometimes low and tender, mourning a loss. Every pause carried meaning. Every moment of silence held an echo of deep reverence. The fire crackles softly, and you can almost hear that first note float through the night. The Fulani epics weren't just about mighty warriors and grand battles. They were about values. Each hero was a vessel, representing something the people needed to remember. There were stories of herders who braved terrible storms to save their cattle, tales of clever women who outwitted greedy chiefs, and even legends of children who spoke truths that their elders feared to hear. In every verse, courage was carefully balanced by humility, and honor was always tempered by compassion. These tales were never frozen in a single version. A griot might change a small detail, a location, a name, a particular victory to better reflect his audience's own experiences and struggles. And so, the epics evolved right alongside the people. Each retelling was both a continuation of the past and a renewal of their collective identity in the present. The night breeze carries the sound of low singing, like gentle waves on the shore of time. Every Fulani epic carried two distinct layers, one for the ear and one for the heart. To a casual listener, it was just an entertaining tale, a good story to pass the time. But to those who understood the deeper language of metaphor, it was a coded philosophy, a guide to living a meaningful life. A drought in the story might symbolize the destructive nature of human greed. A wandering cow could represent a restless soul searching for its place in the world. Even a violent storm might signify the anger of neglected ancestors. In this way, the griot became both philosopher and poet, his art a beautiful bridge between ancient wisdom and everyday wonder. The stars shimmer above, as if nodding in quiet agreement. No Fulani epic could exist without rhythm. Even when a story was told without music, there was always a better hidden pulse that followed the rhythm of the human heart. The griot's own breath was the metronome. Listeners would often sway with the flow of the story, unconsciously nodding their heads, humming along, or tapping their fingers on the earth. This shared rhythm is what made memory possible. It locked the words directly into the body. When a griot grew old and it was time to pass his songs to an apprentice, he didn't just teach the lines, he taught the timing. He'd say, "The story lives in the silence between the notes. Protect that silence." And the young ones listened, learning precisely when to pause, when to breathe, and when to let the audience rest in a moment of pure awe. The fire fades to deep red coals. The hum of insects fills the quiet. Through centuries of conquest, migration, and immense change, the Fulani griots held on to these epics like shields. They understood a fundamental truth. Whoever controlled memory controlled dignity. When foreign empires rose and fell, when the written script began to replace the spoken word, the griots kept the voice of their people alive stubbornly, proudly, and beautifully. Even under colonial rule, when written records tried to define and contain African identity, the griots' oral histories whispered back a powerful truth. We remember ourselves. You cannot rewrite us. Every recited epic became an act of cultural survival. Each line carried a quiet defiance, disguised as simple devotion. And through those powerful, enduring rhythms, the Fulani spirit endured. We can almost hear the echo of those who refused to forget, even when silence was easier. Fulani epics were designed to be unforgettable. Their use of repetition of names, journeys, and proverbs worked like the ripples from a drumbeat, echoing long after the griot's voice had faded into the night. Even years later, someone might find themselves humming a single verse while herding their cattle or walking to the market. And the entire story, with all its emotion and wisdom, would come rushing back. This was their secret technology, an oral repetition that rivaled the permanence of any written text. Words carried by rhythm became immortal. The last ember collapses into ash, and somewhere a soft flute begins to play. For the Fulani griot, the poem never truly had an end. When one griot passed away, another would take up the refrain. And so the story continued, like an unbroken circle of breath passed from ancestor to descendant. In every verse, every melody, every quiet hum under the stars, a single, powerful truth endured. We are our stories. When modern writers first began to transcribe these epics, they discovered something profound. No two versions were ever exactly the same. They realized what the griots had known all along. Perfection isn't found in absolute accuracy, but in continuity. The story must live, even if it changes. The voice must speak, even if it sometimes trembles. You can feel the weight of generations resting in this silence, like a calm ocean just before the dawn. Have you ever listened to the wind and felt like it was telling you a story? In the Sahel, that vast expanse of land south of the Sahara, the night winds don't just howl, they whisper. They carry tales from one generation to the next. For the Fulani people, these winds are alive, humming with the breath of ancestors. Imagine this: a low fire crackles, casting a warm orange glow. Thousands of stars glitter in the endless night sky. A griot, a West African storyteller and historian, sits with his kora. The instrument, a 21-string lute harp, gleams as he begins to play. Each pluck of a string is not just a musical note, it's a piece of memory, a bridge connecting the living to the long departed. For the Fulani, storytelling isn't just a way to pass the time. It is a sacred inheritance, a duty, a mirror polished by centuries of migration, hardship, and survival. Their great epic poems, like the tale of Samba Galadio, Silamaka and Pularu, and Kidara, not just stories, they are rivers of verse, carrying the moral, spiritual, and historical DNA of an entire people. Every line, learned by heart and transmitted through sound, is both a historical archive and a prophecy for the future. Let's journey into one of these epics, the story of Samba Galadio. It's a classic tale of a prince cast into exile, betrayed by his own family, who finds redemption not through revenge, but through wisdom and endurance. On one level, it's a political story, but it's also a deeply spiritual one. It teaches a powerful lesson. True kingship isn't inherited by blood. It's earned through patience, justice, and self. Samba's long journey across hostile lands perfectly mirrors the Fulani's own history of wandering through drought, war, and constant change. His trials facing hunger, doubt, and profound loneliness speak to a shared feeling of exile that runs deep in Fulani memory. Every verse of Samba's story is sung to the rhythm of the kora. Its 21 strings are said to mimic the very heartbeat of the desert, slow, deliberate, and eternal. The griot's voice rises like a swirl of dust and settles like the evening wind. The young people in the audience listen intently, not just for entertainment, but to learn how to live a meaningful life. When the griot sings of Samba's unbreakable spirit, it's a direct message to the listener. You will be tested too. You will walk long, difficult roads. But your dignity must remain untouched, no matter what. Then there is the epic of Silamaka and Pularu's story of two heroes, a duet of opposites. Silamaka is the warrior, the embodiment of courage and defiance. Pularu is the mystic, representing deep reflection and divine insight. Their tale starts with a simple contest of strength and wit, but soon spirals into a grand odyssey that explores complex moral questions. As the Griot tells their story, he might pause, drawing patterns in the sand with a stick, as if tracing the very paths of their fate. Children lean in, their eyes wide with wonder. The elders nod in knowing recognition, because, even though they've heard the story countless times, it feels both familiar and new with every telling. In the story, Silamaka's sword gleams with the light of justice, while Pularu's words shimmer with the power of prophecy. Together, they represent the essential duality of Fulani life, the balance between the warrior and the wanderer, the farmer and the herder, the person of action and the person of spirit. The epic shows that one cannot exist without the other. This balance is what keeps society from falling into chaos. This rhythm of balance pulses beneath all Fulani epics, the constant negotiation between movement and belonging, freedom and responsibility, pride and humility. Perhaps the most mystical of the Fulani epics is Kaidara. Here, the journey is not across land, but into the self. It tells of a humble traveler who descends into a symbolic underworld, not seeking gold or power, but knowledge. What he discovers are truths hidden in layers of metaphor. The importance of generosity, the power of humility, and the emptiness of greed. Kaidara itself is a spirit of hidden wisdom, often disguised as an old beggar or a lonely wanderer. The story teaches that to recognize Kaidara is to see beyond mere appearances, to understand that wealth without morality is just a poverty of the soul. In this story, and in Fulani philosophy as a whole, true wealth isn't measured in cattle or coin. It's measured in something called semtind, a complex word that means dignity, modesty, and deep respect for others. A person who is rich in semtind doesn't boast. They walk quietly, yet their very presence commands respect. The Griot often ends the tale of Kaidara with a powerful proverb: "He who gives to the poor lends to his future." It's a moral drumbeat that echoes through the night, grounding the audience in the belief that wisdom and virtue are what truly make a person noble. Across all these epics, you can feel a single, unifying pulse, the heartbeat of the desert. The sand, the wind, the rhythmic movement of herds and caravans, all of it is woven into the fabric of the verse. The sound of hoofbeats merges with the cadence of the poetry. The long pauses in the storytelling mimic the vast, silent stretches of a long journey. For the Fulani, the verse and the landscape are one and the same. The rhythm of walking behind cattle, the rise and fall of the horizon, the distant sound of bells and bleating goat saw. These things feed into the structure of their oral poetry. It is the rhythm of endurance, the meter of survival itself. Because of this, a griot song is more than just musical, it's geographical. Each region adds its own unique accent to the tales. A griot from Mali might sing with a deep, resonant bass and use long, dramatic pauses, mirroring the vast, open plains. One from the coast of Senegal might use lighter, more playful tones, like a coastal breeze. These differences are subtle but full of meaning, just as each Fulani clan carries a slightly different version of the same ancestral memory. This incredible diversity within unity is what has kept the Fulani identity vibrantly alive, despite centuries of dispersal across the Sahel, from Guinea to Cameroon, from Niger to Nigeria. They carry the same stories, shaped by local voices, but always tethered to the same moral core. To listen to a Fulani epic is to sit inside time itself. You are hearing words that were first spoken before modern kingdoms were born, before lines were drawn on maps. You are stepping into a lineage where memory is the most valuable currency, and storytelling is the ultimate tool for survival. A single performance could last for several nights. The griot would begin at dusk and continue until dawn, stopping only when the firewood burned low or the stars began to fade. The audience men, women, herders, and travelers would gather close, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm milk or tea. They would hum along during the refrains, turning the performance into a communal heartbeat. The griot's body would sway with the music, his eyes half closed, his spirit tuned to something ancient and powerful. At the edges of the firelight, children would doze off, dreaming of the heroes and spirits from the stories. The elders would murmur blessings, ensuring the story's protection for another night. These weren't just performances. They were profound acts of preservation. In a culture without written archives, every griot was a living library, and every audience was a living archive. Through repetition, emotion, and melody, the Fulani ensured their epics would survive the droughts, wars, and migrations that erased so many other traditions. As one elder griot from the town of Labe once said, "The paper may burn, but the song cannot." And so, it continues. Each griot teaches the next generation not just the words, but the silences between them. In Fulani epics, even the pauses are filled with meaning. It is in these moments of silence that wisdom is allowed to breathe. The themes in these poems, sexile, courage, divine justice, are not relics of a forgotten past. They are moral tools still used today by Fulani parents to teach their children resilience. A boy learning to herd cattle might be told the story of Samba Galadio to remind him that even when he feels lost, he must walk with dignity. A girl learning the art of preparing milk might hear the story of Kaidara to understand that generosity always brings its own protection. Every story is a mirror. Every hero is a teacher. Every ancient line points toward the same timeless truth. The desert tests you, but it also reveals your true self. In the rhythm of the griot's voice, you can hear the echoes of endless migrations of families walking under a punishing sun, of cattle bells tinkling at dawn, of songs shared between strangers who recognize each other not by face, but by the melody of their shared history. To be Fulani is to live a life in motion, yet carry a stable, unshakable world within you, a moral compass built from verse and rhythm. And so, the griot sings on. His words curl into the night air like incense. The fire crackles, the dunes shift in the darkness. The ancestors listen. And across the centuries, the voices of wanderers and kings continue to dance on the desert wind. When the last chord of the kora fades into the Sahel wind, silence doesn't mean an ending, it signifies a transfer. In Fulani tradition, a story isn't finished until it has moved. From one mouth to another, from one camp to the next, from an elder's breath to a youth's heartbeat, this constant movement is what keeps Fulani memory alive. As the Fulani say, a word that travels is a word that lives. And for centuries, their words have traveled across rivers and savannas, through drought and conquest, from Mali to Senegal, from Niger to Cameroon. Yet they survived, not because they were written down, but because they were sung. The griot was more than a performer. He was a walking archive. His tools, voice, rhythm, and repetition were precise technologies of memory. Each verse was designed to stick in the mind like a seed in dry soil. Each refrain was a map, guiding both teller and listener through the winding path of an epic that could last for days. A griot would train his memory not through simple memorization, but through pattern. Cadence became structure. Melody became a grid. Each part of the story was tied to a distinct rhythm, a melodic turn that cued the next line. Like a bead on a string, Every verse depended on the one before it. The kora and hadu weren't just instruments, they were mnemonic devices. The rising and falling notes mirrored the narrative tension, a sense for courage, descents for loss, a quick rhythm for battle, a slow drone for mourning. When the griot plucked a string in a certain pattern, his memory was triggered not just of the words, but of the emotions held within them. Sometimes a griot would pause mid-song and hand the kora to his apprentice. The younger one would pick up the melody without hesitation, his fingers finding the right string by instinct, his tongue catching the rhythm like catching a breath. In that moment, memory had traveled fluidly, seamlessly. This oral precision was not a casual skill. It was protected by ritual. An apprenticeship could last for years. Before a griot was allowed to perform publicly, he had to memorize dozens of genealogies, master several modes of musical recitation, and learn the coded proverbs that unlocked the deeper meanings behind the stories. Fulani griots were guardians of three intertwined forms of knowledge: the lineage of people, the lineage of places, and the lineage of sound. To forget a verse was not just a mistake, it was a break in the chain of identity. That's why the elders guarded their stories as fiercely as they guarded their cattle. As the Fulani migrated following rain, grazing lands, and trade, their griots became the carriers of an invisible infrastructure. They connected distant communities not through roads or written letters, but through shared narratives that bound them together across vast distances. When a Fulani caravan left Fouta Jalan in Guinea and reached the plains of Niger, it brought not only livestock, but also songs, proverbs, and tales. The griots traveling with them exchanged verses with other griots, comparing their versions of epic heroes like Samba Galadio or Kadara. Each performance might add a small local flavor, a unique accent, a local proverb, a new gesture, but the core of the story always remained intact. Through this exchange, the Fulani epics became living maps of West Africa. They carried within them the memory of rivers crossed, kingdoms visited, and alliances formed. To this day, certain griots in Mali can trace the path of their ancestors just by following the changes in a single song, noting where a line was added, where another was shortened, or where a refrain shifted from French to Pulaar. Each variation marks a migration, a footprint left in sound. The story moves, and through it, the people do too. This is how memory traveled long before ink and paper, through sound. Through breath, through a repetition strong enough to outlast empires. When the great Fulani jihads reshaped West Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries, the griots became bridges between the old world and the new. As Islamic reformers built schools and clerics began writing in Arabic script, the griots didn't resist. Instead, they incorporated Quranic rhythms and imagery into their ancient recitations. Suddenly, the epic tales of Samba and Silamaka were being sung alongside verses from the Quran. The griot's invocation of ancestral spirits found a new harmony with Islamic praise of Allah's wisdom. This blending created a uniquely Fulani aesthetica, rhythm both divine and earthy, both sacred and deeply familiar. Memory didn't resist change, it absorbed it. Just as rivers carve new paths but still flow to the sea, Fulani storytelling adjusted to new faiths and frontiers without ever losing its essence. Every community had its keepers of tone, the ones who knew exactly when to raise a verse and when to soften it, when to use humor to ease tension, and when to weave sorrow into a melody. A griot's reputation was built not only on the accuracy of his memory, but also on his emotional truth. The audience would know if a performer's heart was not aligned with the story they were telling. They could feel it. The rhythm would falter. The sacred connection would break. To guard against this, griots often began their performances with a blessing. Let the ancestors guide my tongue. Let no word fall empty. That invocation anchored the performance, reminding both the singer and the audience that storytelling was a spiritual actor packed between the living and the dead. In many Fulani villages, children were taught fragments of the great epics long before they could read or write. Mothers sang shortened versions as lullabies to their infants. Herd boys recited lines while leading their cattle to pasture. Traders hummed refrains to pass the time on long journeys between markets. Each word carried small, essential lessons: patience, courage, humility, hospitality. The stories became a part of daily life, woven into the very fabric of ordinary survival. When droughts came, the griot would remind them. Even Samba Galadio walked through thirst. When conflicts broke out between clans, elders would quote Kidara: "He who seeks wisdom must first make peace with silence." And when a family prospered, a neighbor might whisper, "Remember, Pularoo knowledge is wealth unseen." This constant repetition across generations kept the moral memory of the people alive, even when precise historical details began to fade. In modern times, Fulani storytelling continues to travel, though its roots have changed. Radios have replaced campfires. Cell phones have replaced calabashes. Yet the oral rhythm remains. In bustling markets from Mopti to Marua, griots now record digital performances of the old epics, layering traditional chorus strings with the sound of electric guitars, turning ancient cadence into contemporary song. The stories still move, but now they travel through frequencies instead of footsteps. A griot in Cameroon might upload his version of Samba Galadio to YouTube, and another in Guinea could add new verses in replier, digital call and response, echoing across the Sahel. Memory has found a new caravan, but the essence remains the same. A living thread connecting voice to voice, across sand and across time. In Fulani culture, the loss of memory is the loss of identity. A village can rebuild its walls, replace its herds, even recover from war. But if it forgets its stories, it forgets itself. That is why the griot's work was as vital as the herders, the smiths, or the healers. Their tools were not made of metal or hide, but of sound and silence. Their wealth was measured not in cattle, but in verses remembered. Their journey was not across land, but through generations. And that journey continues. Every time a child recites a line, or a traveler hums an old refrain, the ancient map lights up again, that invisible network that binds the entire Fulani world together. Memory, for them, is not something you keep. It's something you carry. When a Fulani griot raises his voice under the wide desert sky, the air itself seems to listen. The notes shimmer like mirages bending over the heat. Each syllable stretches, rolls, and returns as an echo, not just from the dunes, but from the unseen world beyond them. Because, for the Fulani, a story is never only human. It belongs equally to the ancestors, the spirits, and the divine. The griot's art exists in this sacred in-between, half memory, half prayer. His voice is an offering, his song a bridge. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine the fire crackling softly as we rest beneath the stars. Long before books or libraries, the Fulani learned that the spirit of a thing is carried best in sound. When a griot began to chant, he was not simply telling history, he was summoning it. Each name he uttered brought the soul of that person into the present moment. Each verse invoked an ancestor's presence, asking them to listen, to bless, or to correct. This sacred role made griots both revered and feared. They could praise, but they could also curse. Their tongues were said to hold *baraka, *spiritual power, a force that could elevate or destroy. A careless word, they believed, might awaken spirits not yet at rest. So every performance began with a ritual, a soft clearing of the throat, a whispered prayer, sometimes a sprinkling of milk or sand to cool the tongue. In this rhythm of respect, the griot reminded everyone that speech itself was sacred, that language, like fire, could warm or burn depending on how it was handled. In the Sahel's quiet evenings, songs often began with Islamic praise. Griots would invoke Allah, the Prophet, and local saints before turning to ancestral heroes. The two worlds, Islamic and indigenous, did not clash. They coexisted in an elegant tension. The griot's words moved freely between Arabic invocations and full-fold proverbs, between Quranic parables and ancient cattle-herding myths. You might hear him say, as Kadara said, "Wisdom is a road," and as the Quran says, "All roads return to the one." In that single line, 1,000 years of belief converged. This spiritual fusion created something distinctly Fulani, a living theology of sound. The griot's song did not just narrate the world, it kept it balanced. Every beat of the Hadu, every phrase of praise, was a form of remembrance. Dika, as the Sufis call it, repeating divine names through art. The griot's melody became a meditation, his rhythm a rosary of tones, but even the sacred must adapt. As Islam spread deeper into the Sahel, some clerics viewed griots with suspicion, fearing their older spiritual practices might blur the boundaries between faiths. Some griots responded by turning inward, encoding their messages in metaphor. Instead of invoking ancestral spirits directly, they spoke of winds, echoes, or the voices of the wells. Those who understood knew these were coded, ways of speaking about divine memory and ancestral wisdom. Others integrated Quranic storytelling structures, prophetic trials, moral parables redemption arcs, into traditional Fulani epics. In these stories, cattle raids and love journeys mirrored the struggles of prophets. The desert became a symbol of both testing and revelation. Thus, the griot's voice became not a contradiction to Islam, but a vessel of it, reshaped, melodic, and undeniably African. Let's pause here again. A cool wind sweeps through the grass, and the drums soften to a heartbeat's rhythm. Even the instruments carried traces of the sacred. The hadu, a small stringed lute carved from a calabash, was believed to vibrate with ancestral presence. Its sound was earthy and resonant, like footsteps on the ground. Before playing, griots would anoint it with butter or shea oil, murmuring thanks to the spirit of sound itself. A griot once told an ethnography, "The hadu is not wood and string. It is the memory of those who loved before us." And so each note became a prayer, a plea, a remembrance. The calabash drum, struck softly at night, was said to echo the rhythm of a camel's walk, steady, enduring, holy in its patience. To the Fulani, storytelling was never about entertainment. It was about continuity, the thin, luminous thread connecting breath to spirit. Even silence had purpose. After each verse, the griot would pause, letting the audience breathe in the words. That pause was called jam, meaning peace. It symbolized the space where the listener meets the divine. Through this rhythm, sound, silence, sound griots taught an entire cosmology, that life itself moves in cycles of presence and withdrawal, noise and calm, creation and return. In the modern Sahel, you can still find griots who blend microphone and prayer. Their voices drift over radio waves, reciting lines that have traveled for centuries. In some villages, they record blessings for newborns. In others, they perform at weddings, turning genealogies into music once more. But no matter the setting, a dusty courtyard or a digital studio, the same ritual remains. A breath before the first word, a silence after the last. Between those two silences, the griot's spirit sings. To listen to a Fulani griot is to glimpse a living faith, one that believes memory is sacred, that history can pray, that the human voice still carries divine resonance. When the last note fades, and the audience drifts toward sleep or thought, something holy lingers. The griot lowers his head. The stars shimmer above. Somewhere in the distance, a herd bell rings, and the voice that spoke for centuries whispers once more, "I have carried their names, and they have carried me." As dawn breaks across the vast Fulani plains, the first light catches the horns of cattle, making them glint like a forest of silver spears against the horizon. But before the herders even stir, before the first hoof presses into the dewy grass, there's another movement. It's quieter, much older. A man sits by the glowing embers of last night's fire. Across his lap rests a hodu, its gored body shining amber in the early light. He plucks a single string, the sound trembles, floats for a moment, and then melts into the waking world. This man isn't just a musician. He is a descendant of words, a griot whose bloodline is a living library stretching back through centuries of memory. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine the fire crackling softly as we rest beneath the stars. Among the Fulani griots are not just individuals, they are entire lineages, families sworn to the lifelong guardianship of history. These families are often known by their names: the Kauyate of Mali, the Ba of Senegal, the Sissoko and Diaba of Guinea. Each family traces its roots to an ancient patron, a noble ancestor whose stories they have vowed to preserve for all time. A griot's skill isn't learned overnight. It's inherited, just like cattle, like faith, like the sound of a drum that echoes from the distant past. Children born into these families begin their training almost as soon as they can walk, spending far more time listening than they do speaking. They learn the intricate tonal structure of the Fulfilled language before they can even write their own names. They don't memorize praise songs from scrolls or books, but from rhythm itself, the cadence of their elders' breathing, the rise and fall of syllables woven into the lullabies that put them to sleep. By the time they reach adolescence, a young griot has already absorbed dozens of genealogies, a complex web of ancestry stretching across entire kingdoms. They can tell you who married whom, which cattle herds crossed which rivers, and which ancestors broke at peace after a long war. And all of this, every single detail, is carried in their minds. There isn't a single written line, not one inked pajonally living memory, meticulously shaped by discipline and a profound sense of devotion. To the Fulani, these griot lineages are sacred because they are the anchors of identity. They remind every single person, whether they are a noble or a commoner, exactly who they are and which song they belong to. When two Fulani strangers meet for the first time, their conversation doesn't begin with, "What do you do for a living?" Instead, they ask a much more fundamental question: "Whose child are you?" And somewhere, a griot holds the answer. This incredible ability to map identity through story gives griot families immense respect, even among powerful rulers. Their archives are not stored in scrolls or libraries. They are held within souls. As the saying goes, to forget a griot's name is to forget your own shadow. Let's take another pause. The wind hums through the tall grass, carrying with it the murmur of old voices. The daily life of a griot family revolves around three things: performance, mentorship, and travel. They exist in a space between the sacred and the social, constantly moving from a royal court to a bustling market, from a birth ceremony to a funeral. and each time they must recalibrate their tone to perfectly match the occasion. A wedding demands laughter and songs of praise. A funeral requires solemn remembrance and comfort. A naming ceremony calls for joy and words of prophecy for the newborn child. Every song begins with a sacred invocation. May the ancestors' words come easily, and may the living listen well. With that, the griot begins their descenter melodic journey deep into the ancestry of everyone present. No two performances are ever identical. A griot has to read the room like a skilled diplomat, sensing the undercurrents of pride, grief, tension, or even jealousy, and then subtly adjust the story accordingly. Giving too much praise can awaken envy in others. Speaking too much unvarnished truth can stir up old resentments. So the griot learns balance, tact, and profound wisdom, knowing exactly when to honor and when to gently tease. In Fulani philosophy, this art of calibrated speech is known as sutura, a concept that embodies discretion, grace, and emotional intelligence, all delivered through the spoken word. Over time, this skill made griot families the natural custodians of diplomacy. When rival clans had a quarrel, griots were summoned to mediate. When noble houses were preparing to intermarry, it was the griots who negotiated the terms. Their words carried more than just melody. They carried legitimacy and authority. An elder might say, the griot is the tongue of peace. When he speaks, blood remembers its duty. Their neutrality was their greatest strength. They served everyone, yet they belonged to no one. This independence, though often precarious, gave griots the freedom to speak truths that others dared not whisper. In the great historical kingdoms of the Sahel, places like Mashina, Sokoto, and Futa Toro, griots were recorded as trusted advisors to emirs, as mediators in complex trade disputes, and as teachers of court etiquette. Their influence reached deep into the political heart of the region. But behind this glory and respect, there was also hardship. Because griots belonged to hereditary castes, they sometimes faced social marginalization from the upper classes they served. Though nobles depended on their words for their very identity, they often refused to intermarry with them. A griot could dine beside a king, but he could never become one. This paradox of being both respected and excluded forged in them a characteristic humility and an incredible resilience. They understood better than anyone that power is fleeting, but memory is immortal. And so they kept singing. Let's pause one last time. The fire dims to a soft glow, and somewhere in the distance, a flute plays a low, wandering note. Each griot family had its own signature repertoire, like a spiritual fingerprint that was uniquely theirs. The Diabate family, for instance, favored epics of resistance and endurance. The Koyata carried the praise songs for the ancient kings of Mali. The Ba family sang of migration, of cattle, and of the rivers, the very lifeblood of the nomadic Fulani people. Within these family houses, the craft was passed directly from mouth to ear, from hand to string. There were no formal rehearsals, no written scripts. There was only repetition, gentle correction, and love. Young apprentices would rise before dawn to recite ancestral lines to their elders. If they made a mistake, the correction wouldn't come through scolding, but through performance. The elder would simply sing the correct verse again, a little slower this time, until the rhythm locked itself into the apprentice's chest, becoming as natural as their own heartbeat. This wasn't just education. It was a form of initiation, spiritual inheritance dressed in the beautiful clothes of music. A griot's memory wasn't just his own. It was a communal treasure. Families would gather in cycles to refresh the river, as they called it, This was a special gathering where each griot would recite their known stories aloud, while the others listened, corrected, added details, or completed forgotten lines. Through this living, breathing dialogue, historical accuracy was preserved, and creativity was encouraged. This was their oral university, their eternal archive. There were no gates, no tuition fees, only a shared, sacred responsibility to the truth. With time, these griot families became great cultural dynasties, their legacies stretching into modern Africa and far beyond. Some, like the world-renowned Tumani Diabet in Mali, carried the Hadu's descendant, the Korotu international stages, transforming ancestral songs into celebrated global art. Others became modern poets, historians, and educators, reinterpreting the ancient role of the griot for a new age. But even now, after all this time, when you ask them about their craft, they all give you the same humble answer. I am not the owner of the story. I am merely its caretaker. And so, beneath every performance, whether it's in a dusty village courtyard or a grand concert, hall hums the same powerful lineage, an unbroken chain of memory that links the past to the present and the earth to the spirit. When the griot plucks his first note, the ancestors listen, and when he finishes, the wind carries his words away, not just as sound, but as continuity. That is the true essence of a griot's bloodline. They are born not into silence, but into song. And through them, the story of the Fulani and of Africa itself continues to breathe. The night deepens. The embers of our fire glow low, and the voice of the griot, now older in tone, carries a quiet authority. We've traveled through the dust of history, from the lonely wanderers who kept stories alive, to the sacred poets who turned memory into devotion. Now we enter the grand tents and echoing courtyards of those who gave these voices power, the nobles of the word, the patrons who understood that a people without its stories was a people adrift. In the Fulani kingdoms that rose between the Senegal and Niger rivers, the griot's voice was as valuable as the king's sword. He was the mirror of the ruler, his memory, his conscience, and at times, his torment. To sit at court as a griot was both a privilege and a peril. You could rise in a single night if your story pleased the ears of power. But you could also vanish, forgotten by the next dawn, if the truth in your song struck too close to the throne. They were called Lowall, the ones who followed the way, the guardians of royal speech. In some Fulani courts, a griot wouldn't speak without being summoned by a hand signal. In others, he began only when a calabash of milk was placed before him, a sign that his words would be received with grace. The milk represented purity of speech. The griot's words, once poured, could not be taken back, just as milk cannot be gathered once spilled. Imagine a Fulani griot dressed in deep indigo robes, standing before a seated noble surrounded by ornate mats and brass ornaments, the light of torches flickering against carved calabash. Across West Africa, from the Fouta Toro in Senegal to the plains of Adamawa, a pattern emerged. Every noble family had its griot, and every griot had their lineage of loyalty. This relationship was older than politics. It was sacred. A griot's family might serve the same line of rulers for generations, recording marriages, wars, debts, and blessings. When a ruler's child was born, it was the griot who named them. When that child came of age, it was the griot who recited the ancestry that gave their name weight. And when they died, it was the griot who turned their memory into immortality through song. There is a saying among the Fulani, a man without a griot is like a drum without skin, silent even when struck. And so, griots were rewarded not merely with coin, but with cattle, land, and honor. Some owned herds that rivaled those of their patrons. They were part of a delicate balance, neither servants nor equals, but something in between. Living bridges between power and the people. Picture a Fulani nobleman in embroidered white robes, presenting a finely carved staff to an elderly griot beneath a wide acacia tree. A crowd of villagers looking on in respectful silence. Let's be clear, the Fulani griots attached to courts were not poor men of the streets. They moved with the rhythm of festivals and pilgrimages. They sat beside rulers and merchants, their words opening doors that no sword could unlock. Some grew rich from praise songs. Others collected tribute from families whose names they immortalized in verse. They were known for their dendel, a poetic improvisation that could weave praise and satire with the same breath. A griot's tongue could build a man's reputation or strip it bare before a crowd. And that power made even the mighty cautious in the legendary city of Timbuktu. Visiting Fulani griots would sometimes perform before scholars, testing how much history could survive in sound. The scholars would nod, smiling, recognizing dates and names hidden beneath metaphor. The griots, in turn, would adjust their rhythm to the audience, a dialogue of intellect and art that no book could fully capture. It was there, under the lanterns of learning, that oral history and written history began to shake hands. The griot's word, once carried by breath alone, began to seep into ink and parchment, never losing its pulse, only gaining endurance. Can you see it? A Fulani griot performing in Timbuktu's market square, surrounded by traders, women with baskets, and scholars in turbans taking notes by lantern light. But not all griots were attached to kings. Many worked with merchants, caravan leaders, or wealthy herders. Their performances became a form of social currency, a kind of networking in song. If a griot praised your cattle, your name might travel to distant markets. If he mocked you, your trade could suffer. In a world where reputation was wealth, words were gold dust. This gave rise to what historians call patronage cycles. A griot might travel with one caravan in the dry season and another in the rains, collecting stories, spreading fame, and binding communities through shared memory. These griots were the early journalists of the Sahel, moving faster than letters and more trusted than rumors. As one Fulani elder said, "The griot is the wind between villagers and scene, but carrying everything that matters." And indeed, even as kingdoms fell and empires shifted, it was the griot's wind that kept the people bound together. Think of a desert caravan under a twilight sky. A griot rides atop a camel, Korah slung over his back, his mouth open mid-song as wind blows through the dunes. Among the Fulani, nobility was not measured only in bloodlines. It was also measured in mastery, the ability to speak truth with grace. A griot might not wear a crown, but his voice could weigh as much as gold. When disputes arose between clans, it was often the griot who mediated, using history as a bridge. He would remind both sides of old kinships, shared ancestors, forgotten alliances, and slowly tempers would cool. Through words, peace returned. In this way, the griot became not just an entertainer, but a diplomat, a healer, a philosopher. He was nobility of another kind, the nobility of wisdom. This mirrors the broader African ideal that the tongue builds the house. Power was not only what you held in your hand, but what you could hold in your mouth and deliver without causing harm. Picture two Fulani clans gathered in a circle under the evening sky. A griot stands between them, gesturing calmly as both groups lower their weapons and nod solemnly. As the 19th century unfolded and the empires of the Fulani jihad states began to wane, the court that had sustained griots started to fade. Colonial administrators replaced nobles. The griot stool was replaced by the clerk's desk, where songs once shaped public memory, reports and ledgers now defined what was real. And yet, even then, the griots adapted. They began to perform at weddings, naming ceremonies, and new political rallies. Their poetry changed, shape more personal, less royal, but still potent. They spoke not to kings, but to common folk who still craved the warmth of recognition, the safety of belonging. The nobility of the word survived not because it was written, but because it was needed. Even under the noise of modern cities, people still turned to the griot when they needed truth dressed in beauty. Today, in cities like Dakar, Niamey, and Bamako, Fulani, griots still thrive. Their words are now recorded on smartphones, their songs streamed online, but the principle remains unchanged. Every voice needs a listener, and every memory needs a keeper. Some have even formed cultural associations to preserve old lineages. Families trace their griot ancestry back to royal households not for status, but for identity. Because, in the Fulani worldview, to forget one's griot ancestors is to lose one's place in the cosmic dialogue. Their nobility is not inherited from kings, but from the sacred duty to speak to, remember without bitterness, and to teach without pride. Their palaces are no longer built from mud and stone, but from the listening hearts of their people. Just imagine a young Fulani storyteller performing into a microphone in a small studio, with old photographs of his ancestors in traditional dress lining the wall behind him. The nobles of the word were never only the ones with crowns. They were those who guarded meaning when kingdoms fell. They were proof that language, when sung with honesty, could outlive power itself. In every era, someone must stand between memory and forgetting. For the Fulani, that someone has always been the griot. He may no longer stand before kings, but the spirit of the court of respect, rhythm, and remembrance still flows through his words. And so, as the last sparks fade from our fire, we realize that the griot's true patron is not any man or ruler. It is time itself, for only time has listened to every song and remembered every name. The stars are fading and the dawn creeps in. But before we close our eyes, the voice of the griot lingers soft, measured, eternal. The night is nearly done. The last embers of our fire sigh, the desert air cools, and the stars lean low, as if to listen one final time. In the flickering orange light, the griot's face is calm, his eyes reflecting both the fire and the centuries. We have walked beside him through deserts and courts, through silence and song. Now, as the horizon begins to soften into the first blush of dawn, we listen to the final echo, the sound of memory whispering its way into the future. Every story told by a griot begins in darkness and ends in light. For when the tale concludes and the audience rises to leave, the silence left behind is not empty, it hums. It hums with fragments of truth, with rhythm, with a sense of belonging. This hum is what Fulani elders call Lawal Ao, the second path, the echoing road. It is the road a story takes when it leaves the mouth of the griot and begins to live inside the listener. You see, griots never believed their work ended with the performance. Their true art began after the last word was spoken, when the listener carried the tale home, repeated it to their children, or dreamt of it in their sleep. That is why Fulani oral traditions are not linear histories. They are living orbits, stories that circle through time, reshaped with each telling, reborn with each listener. Each echo carries a slightly new face, a new rhythm, a new truth. And this is how memory survives long after parchment has turned to ash and kingdoms have crumbled. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles faintly, and we breathe in the stillness before daybreak. Today, The echo of the griot can be heard in the most unexpected places. You'll find it in the calm, measured authority of the radio announcer speaking full-filed at dawn. You'll find it in the rhythm of modern Fulani rappers, their verses tracing ancestry, dignity, and struggle. You'll hear it in classrooms where teachers recite proverbs that once lived only in the breath of the elders. The medium has changed, yes. The tools, microphones, cameras, social media, the new drums and calabashes, but the core purpose remains the same. A sacred desire to preserve identity through sound. In towns across Mali and Senegal, a new generation of storytellers is racing against time. They record old griots before their voices vanish. They digitize songs, transcribe genealogies, and film performances beneath ancient Baobab trees. This isn't just nostalgia, it is an act of survival. Because when a griot's voice disappears, an entire language of emotion, history, and wisdom vanishes with it. And yet, even these digital echoes can carry the same warmth that the firelight once did. They cross oceans, finding new ears on different continents. They remind distant descendants that their history is not something to be passively read, it is something to be actively heard and felt. Let's pause here for a moment. The wind carries faint laughter from a nearby village, and the first rooster cries out somewhere far away. The griots always understood something that modern storytellers are only now beginning to relearn. A story is not simply information, it is energy. Each syllable, when spoken with intention, carries something invisible, a vibration that awakens empathy. That vibration is what turns a simple narrative into a shared spirit. And that is why Fulani griots performed not merely to entertain, but to heal. Their songs were used to mend disputes between families, to bless long journeys, to honor births, and to ease the heavy burden of grief. When the griot's voice quivered with emotion, the people did not just listen. They felt alignment returning to the world, a sense of rightness settling back into place. Even now, when you listen to recordings of griots chanting their lineages, something happens deep in your chest, a subtle rhythm, a pulse older than reason. It is the sound of balance being restored. And that is what makes these echoes so sacred. Whether they are carried by the wind, by a cassette tape, or by a Wi-Fi signal, they still do what they have always done. Remind the listener that they belong to a continuous story, a sound that will never truly end. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire is now mostly ash, yet somehow the warmth remains. Among Fulani families descended from griots, the inheritance is not gold or land, it is memory. Children are still trained to recite proverbs long before they can read. Elders still whisper family lineages at bedtime, ensuring that every name, every story, becomes a part of the next generation's breath. But this inheritance is heavy. To be born into a griot family is to be born with an immense responsibility. You do not own the stories, they own you. You are their guardian, their vessel, their solemn promise of continuity. And yet, that burden is also a profound blessing. Because to carry the words of your ancestors is to walk with thousands of unseen companions. Every time a young griot begins a tale with the familiar words our fathers used to say, the ancestors lean in from the world beyond to listen. They nod, they smile. They know that they have not been forgotten. Let's pause here for a moment. The world feels smaller now, contained in this one circle of light and memory. So what does it mean to be a griot in the 21st century? Perhaps it means to be anyone who carries truth with rhythm, anyone who turns memory into melody and pain into poetry. In that sense, storytellers across Africa today, the filmmakers, the poets, the YouTubers, the musicians are the modern griots. They still sing for identity. They still travel, though their roads are now digital highways. They still confront injustice, weaving truth into song the way their ancestors once did with string and skin. And you, too, listener, are part of this lineage now. By hearing this story, you have entered the echo. It may hum inside you later, today, when you're walking, or dreaming, or remembering a grandparent's laughter. That hum is the griot's real legacy. Not a name carved in stone, not a grand monument, but a resonance that never, ever fades. Let's pause here for a moment. Feel that hum beneath your ribs. It's older than you, and it's not done speaking yet. When dawn finally breaks, the griot's silhouette softens against the brightening horizon. He doesn't speak now, he just listens. The desert wakes around him, the wind shifts, and the first call to prayer floats across the sand. His duty for tonight is done. But he knows that somewhere, someone will take up the next story. Perhaps it will be a child with a smartphone in near me. Perhaps an old man humming softly to himself in a Johannesburg taxi rank. Or perhaps it will be you, replaying these words in your mind long after this video ends. Because once a story enters your breath, it belongs to you and you, in turn, belong to it. That is the echo beyond the firelight, the part of the tale that lives unseen, whispered across time, lighting one heart after another, like stars passed gently from hand to hand. Let's pause here for the final time. The fire has gone quiet. The air tastes of ash and peace. And as the griot's shadow disappears into the light, his voice lingers, soft, ancient, and eternal. The night is nearly done. The last embers of our fire sigh, the desert air cools, and the stars lean low, as if to listen one final time. In the flickering orange light, the griot's face is calm, his eyes reflecting both the fire and the centuries. We have walked beside him through deserts and courts, through silence and song. Now, as the horizon begins to soften into dawn, we listen to the final echo, the sound of memory, whispering its way into the future. Every story told by a griot begins in darkness and ends in light. For when the tale ends and the audience rises to leave, the silence left behind is not empty, it hums. It hums with fragments of truth, with rhythm, with belonging. This hum is what Fulani elders call Lawal, Ao, the second path, the echoing road. It is the road a story takes when it leaves the mouth of the griot and begins to live inside the listener. You see, griots never believed their work ended with the performance. Their true art began after the last word was spoken, when the listener carried the tale home, repeated it to their children, or dreamt of it in their sleep. That is why Fulani oral traditions are not linear histories. They are living orbit stories that circle through time, reshaped with each telling, reborn with each listener. Each echo carries a slightly new face, a new rhythm, a new truth. And this is how memory survives long after parchment has burned and kingdoms have crumbled. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles faintly, and we breathe in the stillness before daybreak. Today, the echo of the griot can be heard in unexpected places. You'll find it in the calm authority of the radio announcer speaking full-fooled at dawn. You'll find it in the rhythm of modern Fulani rappers, their verses tracing ancestry, dignity, and struggle. You'll find it in classrooms where teachers recite proverbs that once lived only in the breath of elders. The medium has changed, yes. The tools, microphones, cameras, social media, new drums and calabashes. But the core remains the same, a sacred desire to preserve identity through sound. In towns across Mali and Senegal, Young storytellers record old griots before their voices vanish. They digitize songs, transcribe genealogies, and film performances beneath baobab trees. This is not nostalgia, it is survival. For when a griot's voice disappears, an entire language of emotion vanishes with it. And yet, even digital echoes can carry the same warmth as the firelight once did. They cross oceans and find new ears. They remind distant descendants that their history is not something to be read, it is something to be heard. Let's pause here for a moment. The wind carries faint laughter from a nearby village, and the first rooster cries out somewhere far away. The griots always understood something that modern storytellers are only beginning to relearn, that a story is not simply information. It is energy. Each syllable, when spoken with intention, carries something invisible, vibration that awakens empathy. That vibration is what turns a narrative into a shared spirit. And that is why Fulani griots performed not merely to entertain, but to heal. Their songs were used to mend disputes, bless journeys, honor births, and ease grief. When the griot's voice quivered with emotion, the people did not just listen, they felt alignment returning to the world. Even now, when you hear recordings of griots chanting their lineages, something happens deep in your chest, a subtle rhythm, a pulse older than reason. It is the sound of balance being restored. And that is what makes these echoes sacred. Whether carried by wind, by cassette, or by Wi-Fi, they still do what they have always done. Remind the listener that they belong to a continuous story, a sound that will never end. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire is now mostly ash, yet somehow the warmth remains. Among Fulani families descended from griots, the inheritance is not gold or land, it is memory. Children are still trained to recite proverbs before they can read. Elders still whisper family lineages at bedtime, ensuring that every name becomes part of the next generation's breath. But this inheritance is heavy. To be born into a griot family is to be born with responsibility. You do not own the stories, they own you. You are their guardian, their vessel, their promise of continuity. And yet, that burden is also a blessing, because to carry the words of your ancestors is to walk with thousands of unseen companions. Every time a young griot begins a tale with "our fathers used to say," the ancestors lean in to listen. They nod, they smile. They know they have not been forgotten. What does it mean to be a griot in the 21st century? Perhaps it means to be anyone who carries truth with rhythm, anyone who turns memory into melody and pain into poetry. In that sense, African storytellers, today filmmakers, poets, YouTubers, musicians are the modern griots. They still sing for identity. They still travel, though their roads are digital. They still confront injustice, weaving truth into song the way their ancestors once did. You, too, listener, are part of this lineage now. By hearing this story, you have entered the echo. It may hum inside you later when you're walking, or dreaming, or remembering a grandparent's laughter. That hum is the griot's real legacy. Not a name, not a monument, but a resonance that never fades. When dawn finally breaks, the griot's silhouette softens against the horizon. He doesn't speak, now he listens. The desert wakes, the wind shifts, and the first call to prayer floats across the sand. His duty for tonight is done. But he knows that somewhere, someone will take up the next story. Perhaps a child with a smartphone in Niamey. Perhaps an old man humming softly to himself in a Johannesburg taxi rank. Perhaps you replaying these words in your mind long after this video ends. Because once a story enters your breath, it belongs to you and you belong to it. That is the echo beyond the firelight, the part of the tale that lives unseen, whispered across time, lighting one heart after another, like stars passed hand to hand. Let's pause here for the final time. The fire has gone quiet. The air tastes of ash and peace, and as the griot's shadow disappears into the light, his voice lingers soft, ancient, eternal. Thank you for walking this path with us. If these stories have found a home in you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel to help keep the echo alive. We are grateful for your presence. You are under Baobab skies.